Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the November Lunch and Learn at the Harmon Museum. I'm John Zimkus, the Education Director and Historian here. We have some things coming up at the Harmon Museum I think you might be interested in. On December 16th, we're going to have a Christmas concert on Saturday, the 16th, at 2 p.m. It is the Bones of Cincinnatus, a trombone ensemble. Beautiful, great music. They've been here before. They've actually done a lunch and learn, I believe, at one time. $5 for individuals and $10 for the entire family, which is a pretty good deal. That same day, Saturday the 16th, at the Beetle Cabin, Santa will be there from 11 to 1. And it'll be free, and your family and your young ones can all visit the Santa. On Christmas Eve, for the second year, the Harmon Museum will be presenting the Black and White Ball. It is a gala event which will go on from 6 until 10, which we figured out once is when it's New Year's Day in Greenland. So you can have all the fun and still be home and get some good night's sleep.
John, I think the first time you announced it, you said Christmas Eve, and the Black and White Ball is New Year's Eve.
Oh, thank you so very much. I meant New Year's Eve instead of Christmas Eve.
The right night.
Yes. And people dress up. There is beautiful music by Jay Mills, the local fantastic musician here in Lebanon. $70 for individuals, $125 for couples, and for a table of 6, $350. It's a lot of fun, and I think you will enjoy it. As far as lunch and learns are concerned, on December 13th, we're going to have a good friend, Fred Compton, who's going to talk about the story behind Dickens' A Christmas Carol. Fred has always been our speaker for the last, 8 or 9 years, I think, around November or December, and he always fills the house and gives a great story. On January 17th, First Lady Julia Dent Grant will be here, portrayed by Joyce Brownings, who has been another favorite we've had many, many times. And she'll take a look at a lady whose husband was, his status as a president is constantly rising. Grant, he often was put down toward the bottom because of his alcoholic problem. But it is something he strove to control, and it's also some of the things. He was the man who put into action many of the things that Lincoln had thought of, but the action took place with Grant. And Mrs. Grant will let us know her take on these events. On February 21st, Donna Summers, another good friend, the curator of our mid-century modern display and also the Armstrong Gallery of Flight, will talk about Tiffany Glass. She became involved with Tiffany Glass down in Jekyll Island and was fascinated by the skill of this great artisan. And she'll be talking about not only Jekyll Island, but Tiffany himself and all the great glass things he has created. And then on March 20th, Easter collectibles through the years. Linda Martin, who is with us here today, she in the past has talked about her great Halloween collection. And then she said, by the way, I've got Christmas. And then she had a great talk on her Christmas collection and the dozens and dozens and scores of Christmas decorations. And she let us know last year that she has a great Easter collection. So we're very, very pleased to have her as our March Lunch and Learn. And now to introduce our speaker, it is my pleasure to introduce Michael Coyne, the Executive Director of the Harmon Museum.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're fine.
Thank you very much. I was amazed when John picked this topic, not because November and we think of Armistice Day, but also because we often forget why the First World War was called the Great War. And I used to emphasize to my students, when you go to Washington and you stand in awe in front of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial by Maya Lin, and you see the some 60,000 names etched into that wall that were people who sacrificed and gave of their own souls and lives to protect this country in the Vietnam conflict. But to put that in perspective is like this. That is the total of 1 day's war dead in World War I, not 11 years of conflict. 1 day. It's phenomenal. So when John picked this topic, it was appropriate that we commemorate and celebrate and remember those of the Great War. Our historian par excellence, Mr. John Zimbalist. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. I felt kind of funny introducing myself. So, Mike, thank you so very much. The majority of what you're going to hear today was actually a speech I gave 5 years ago at the 100th anniversary of the armistice. So we're going to be looking at the armistice, the beginning of Veterans Day, and Lebanon, Ohio. This is Lebanon around 1910. You can see the Rapid Railway, one of the two interurbans going through the middle of Broadway. This was Lingo's Hardware, the Golden Lamb, then called the Lebanon House, and the Opera House right there. It was 105 years ago last Saturday that an armistice, or truce, if you will, went into effect to stop the fighting in what was called the Great War, or the war to end all wars. It hadn't been called World War I yet. It would be another 20 years before we knew we had to number them. The armistice, or truce, was between the Allies, which were the United States, Britain, France, Russia, Italy, against their opponent, Germany. Now, Germany did have allies of its own, what was known as the Central Powers, and they were Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. But those allies of Germany's had already signed an armistice. So this armistice was between solely Germany and the Allies. And the orange one are the Central Powers, and the green are, in fact, part of the Allied forces. The armistice itself was signed in a railway car in an area in northern France known as Compagnon. It was about 5 a.m. in the morning. It did not technically end the war. The war was ended with the Treaty of Versailles on June 28th, 1919. So that was about 9 months later on. But the fighting stopped. Compagnon, north of Paris, it was signed, as I mentioned, in a railway car. Marshal Foch, the supreme Allied commander of the French army, composed most of the actual armistice writings, and it was decided that fighting would stop later that same day, which was the 11th day in the 11th month at 11 a.m. Now, that was a good, 7 hours after the armistice was signed. It's sort of an unusual thing. Fighting could go on for another 6 or 7 hours. Now, as far as the railway car is concerned, it was eventually put in a museum in Compagnon. And then 21 years later, when Nazi Germany was about to take over France, Hitler demanded that that same railway car be put in the exact same spot it was to end World War I, and he would have the French surrender to the Germans in that railway car. And that's what you see going on here. The car was then shipped to Berlin, where it did stay at one time in the Berlin Cathedral. It moved around quite a bit. It was destroyed in March of 1945, just before the Allies were about to take over Berlin. And it was destroyed because apparently it was believed to be destroyed by the Nazi SS. They did not apparently want the Nazis to surrender in the same railway car, so they did destroy it. As I mentioned, however, fighting continued for another 6 hours, which is kind of, the war is going to stop, but we have to fight on. During those 6 hours, there were 11,000 casualties. During those 6 hours, 2,738 people were killed. Generally accepted as the last soldier to die in World War I is a 23-year-old American, Henry Gunther from Maryland. He died at 10:59, 1 minute to go. He had recently been demoted to private. He was a sergeant. He had written a letter complaining about conditions in France and advising friends not to serve or enlist or even dodge the draft. And because of this critical letter, he was demoted. According to friends of his, he brooded a great deal over his recent reduction in rank and became obsessed with the determination to make good before his officers and fellow soldiers. So he was very risky. He wanted to get his sergeant's stripes back. He exposed himself to machine gun fire, and he died. In 2008, a monument was placed where he fell in Lorraine, France. This is a gentleman dressed up like a World War I French soldier. And in 2010, a memorial plaque was placed near his grave in Baltimore, Maryland. Now, this is Lebanon around that time. This is a fantastic photograph we have in our photo file. It's actually only a small part of it. It was taken around that time. And the reason we know that is because of certain buildings. One, Harmon Hall is here, opening up in 1913. And two, the Oswald's furniture factory across the street is still there. That was torn down in 1926. So we know it's between 13 and 26, so it very well could be the period we're talking about. This is the Golden Lamb over here. This is the Lebanon Opera House. This is Broadway. You can see the gazebo park right here. There was a fountain there, and people made a walkway through that. It's after 1908 because there is the Lebanon LCMB National Bank right there. And this is Fred's Big Store right over here. So when news hit Lebanon, it was 3 a.m. Those who were awake at that time didn't quite believe it because there was another peace announcement a few days earlier on Thursday, November 7th. And people, it's just another false alarm. But it was around 6 o'clock in the morning when it was verified by the Western Star newspaper that the fun began. Now, when Lebanon found out about it, it was already noon in France. So the fighting had stopped an hour earlier. church bells began to ring all over town. And we're talking 6 o'clock in the morning. And so the East Baptist Church, which is on Warren Street, this is how it looked then. The Methodist Episcopal Church, what is now Heritage Hall. The First Presbyterian, now simply the Lebanon Presbyterian, with its original tower, the bell rang there. And at St. Francis de Sales Catholic Church, at the corner of Orchard and Mechanic Street. That church was torn down in 1961, although the house where the rectory where the Catholic priest lived is a private home now. One of the bells that rang that day was in the Cumberland Presbyterian Church, what is now St. Patrick Episcopal Church. The bell in that particular tower was made in Spain in 1632. In the 1830s, the Spanish government took the bells out of many Catholic organizations and sold them at auction. There was a problem between the church and the King of Spain at that time. In 1938, a Lebanon merchant named Robert Knox went to New York and bought the particular bell at auction for $140. In today's money, that'd be about $3,500. And then it was shipped by canal and wagon and finally made it to Lebanon. The cost of the shipping was about $60. It came from a Spanish convent. And that was one of the bells that was ringing that day. The noise attracted the attention of everybody in Lebanon. It is said, according to the paper, few people had breakfast that day. They were all, until noon, pandemonium reigned supreme. Now, we are right here in lot number 90 of this 1891 map of Lebanon. The school was up here in what is now Pleasant Square Park. The post office is right above it. And that's where the school was. But the school had not been in session for weeks. It was supposed to start that Monday. But there, of course, was an issue. The great pandemic, the Spanish flu of 1918. So schools all over were closed. And as I said, we were about to open up. It was a dangerous, dangerous pandemic. In the fall of 1918, the fall of the armistice, 1,541 people were confirmed to have died from the pandemic in Ohio. Cincinnati suffered greatly. A quarter of Cincinnati's population was infected, and 1,700 people died over the entire reign of the pandemic. But so the kids extended their time off by now celebrating the end of the Great War. Stores in town were shut down. People were, many of the stores had signs like, "To hell with the Kaiser," and "Closed to celebrate." Parades sprung out spontaneously all over Lebanon. People shouted themselves hoarse. There were car horns, there were cow bells, tin horns, and tin pans. The executive committee of the Men of Lebanon, who in another 2 years would be the core of the Lebanon Rotary Club, they tried to organize a parade that morning to take place at 9:30. The parade began at Harmon Hall, our Harmon Hall, the heart of the Harmon Museum. And heading the parade was the Harmon Hall Band, which you see up here. Now, the Harmon Hall as an entity was only 5 years old. 5 years old in a day or two after the armistice. But that was probably the only music they had by an organized band at that time. According to newspaper accounts, the procession was said to be nearly a mile long. Now, trying to fathom how they had a mile-long procession without running into themselves. Now, here we have another view of that same photograph I told you about. Here's the 1960s map. From the Golden Lamb to the end of the fairgrounds is 1 mile. That is 1 mile. So how you go through the streets of Lebanon without running into yourself in this procession, I'm not quite sure. The parade went on over the principal streets. Judge Francis M. Hamilton was asked to speak. He was once mayor of Lebanon, and at age 26, actually. In 1918, he was 47 years old, and he was a member of the Circuit Court of Appeals. He gave an address which was said to be quite elegant and quite patriotic. He paid tribute to the brave boys from Lebanon who had helped to achieve this great victory. He then told the crowd that Lebanon will never again hold such a demonstration as on this day, save one, quote, when our boys come home. County Sheriff Charles J. Wagner, who was also a relatively young man, he was 33, was the sheriff, and he also was the chairman of the Good United Way here in Lebanon. He was asked to make some remarks. He climbed into what the Western Star referred to as John Mulford's machine, that's his car. So he gets into the car and he quickly replies that he had never made an attempt to give a public speech before, but added, but who couldn't make a speech today? He would, by the way, when he left the courthouse as sheriff, and that's the sheriff's department in those days, and that's the Warren County Courthouse at that time, he became a teller at the Citizens National Bank. He worked his way up to become eventually, in 1959, the president of the Lebanon Citizens National Bank after the bank merged with the Lebanon National Bank, and then became a member of the chairman of the board for that bank. But he was sheriff at that time. Miss Laura B. Cunningham in elementary school, she taught kindergarten for many, many years. She was 27 at the time. She began to conduct the crowd in some patriotic songs. She was born in Lebanon in 1882. Her mother died 7 days after she was born, and she was named after her mother. So her mother was Laura Cunningham, and she was Laura Cunningham. She graduated from Lebanon High School in 1900, and she is involved in many of the musical events and celebrations which took place in Lebanon for years. This is the Pleasant Street School, where Pleasant Square Park now is, and that's where she taught. Mayor Harry Murphy, who was 45 at this time, was 56 at this time. This was the Lebanon Opera House, which was the town hall at this time. He declared it a holiday. He had been for 45 years the superintendent of the Lebanon Cemetery. He was a member of the village council for 20 years, serving one brief period as mayor during this time of the armistice. He would later on become president of the People's Building and Loan Savings Company. Preparations for a mammoth parade, apparently this one wasn't mammoth, were going to be held that night at 7 o'clock, well after dark. It is said that each corner, new faces joined in the parade. It was reported this is one time when everyone was an equal. The humblest and highest marched side by side. It was then that a number more speeches were given. One was by Judge J.A. Runyon, the namesake of Runyon Field. He was on the Lebanon local draft board at that time. A prominent lawyer, one-time Common Pleas Court judge. He was a graduate of the National Normal University and then went on to study law at University of Michigan. In 1918, he was 66, and as I mentioned, as a member of the local draft board and the president of the Citizens National Bank. And when the Citizens National Bank in 1925 merged with the Lebanon National Bank to become the Lebanon Citizens National Bank, he became their first president. In 1902, talking more about Runyon, a local military company was formed. They trained on Runyon Field. This is Harmon Park. This is Mechanic Street. Runyon actually lived in this house, but he owned this field over here. And because this National Guard unit trained there, and because they were supported quite well by Mr. Runyon, they called themselves Runyon's Rifles. There eventually would be a semi-pro football team, also known as Runyon's Rifles, which was sponsored by the National Guard unit. When the United States got involved in World War I in 1917, Company E of the 1st Ohio National Guard, the Runyon Rifles, was called up. It became Company E of the 147th Infantry, 37th Division. This is another view of Runyon Field from another early photograph of Lebanon. This would be Harmon Park over here. This is Turtle Creek winding its way on the south side of Lebanon. Over here would be the shoe factory. You can recognize this. And this general area over here was Runyon Field, with Runyon's house being right there. The local unit was involved in the Argonne Forest offenses. On the 28th of September, we're talking about 6 weeks or less before the armistice, 21-year-old Sergeant Ralph P. Snook from South Lebanon was wounded. A few days later, on October 2nd of 1918, he died from his wounds. They decided a year later, in October of 1919, to name the newly formed American Legion post in Lebanon the Ralph P. Snook Post 186. In June 5th of 1921, his body had already been shipped back to the United States and buried at the Deerfield Cemetery in South Lebanon. So he, unlike most of the people who did die in World War I from the American side, was not buried in France, but his body was eventually brought back to Lebanon, or to Warren County. Giving another speech that day was attorney Frank C. Anderson, who would later on become a Common Pleas Court judge. He represented the Red Cross that day. At 1918, he was 42 years old. He also was at one time prosecuting attorney of the county. Judge Hamilton, the circuit judge, the one who gave the speech earlier that morning, read a poem written by Corporal William McKinney. McKinney was a local barber who was part of Company E, the 1st Regiment of the Ohio National Guard, now part of the 147th Infantry, 35th Division. The last stanza of his poem reads, "To mothers of men that have fallen on the fields of battle in France, let not your hearts be worried, for they were given a chance to give their hearts to their Maker. Your prayers were not made in vain. When the trumpet of judgment has sounded, you shall be with them again. Three days later, the Western Star had an editorial simply entitled Peace. Part of it said, "Not since the morning star sang the anthem, Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill to men, had the world heard so joyful an announcement as that which the wires carried on Monday morning, announcing the signing of the armistice on the part of the German government. No wonder Lebanon, Warren County, Ohio, the United States, the world acted as though it were insane with joy. No wonder tears and laughters were intermingled. No wonder the old forgot their age and began youth again. No wonder the young assumed the age of discretion and discussed what martial folk had done. Nothing was to be wondered at on Monday. Peace, sweet peace, peace with victory, peace with honor had come. 100 days ago, every cloud was black with the possibilities of an autocratic German victory. 100 days ago, there was hardly a bright spot in the sky as big as a man's hand. But those who had faith saw the bright spot and said, all will be well. The following year, on November 11th, 1919, President Woodrow Wilson issued the first armistice address or proclamation after that particular day. A few years later, in 1926, on June 5th, Congress adopted a resolution requesting that President Calvin Coolidge issue an annual proclamation calling for the observance of November 11th with all the appropriate ceremonies. On May 13th, a congressional act made November 11th of each year a legal holiday. Quote, a day to be dedicated to the cause of world peace and to be thereafter celebrated and known as Armistice Day. In 1945, a Navy World War II veteran, Raymond Weeks from Birmingham, Alabama, had an idea to expand Armistice Day to celebrate all veterans and not just those who had fought or died in World War I. He led a delegation to visit General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II in Europe, who supported the idea of a National Veterans Day. And here we have Weeks meeting with then General Eisenhower. 8.5 years later, after a bill was introduced by Representative Ed Reese of Kansas, President Eisenhower, also from Kansas, signed a bill on May 26, 1954, and it was establishing that Armistice Day would be for all veterans. 6 days later, the bill was amended to change the name of Armistice Day to Veterans Day. And on October 8th, President Eisenhower issued the first Veterans Day proclamation. On June 28, 1968, something called the Uniform Monday Holiday Act was passed. In accordance, beginning with 1971, Veterans Day would be moved to the fourth Monday of October, not even on or near Armistice Day of November 11th. It began on October 25th, 1971. Shortly thereafter, after so many people complained that this was such an important day, a particular day, that a new bill was passed on September 20th of 1975 and signed into law by President Gerald Ford. It would move Veterans Day once again back to November 11th, when the armistice was signed. Dozens of countries do celebrate November 11th. In the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth countries, it's referred to as Remembrance Day. Belgium and France and some other countries do call it Armistice Day. We in the United States do have a Memorial Day where we do celebrate those who have made the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of their country. So for us, Veterans Day is more for the veterans who survived their conflict, who survived their duty. In trying to come up with a quote to end this, I came across one from a Daniel Lebzinski, a former U.S. representative from Illinois, who said on one particular Veterans Day, "On this Veterans Day, let us remember the service of our veterans, and let us renew our national promise to fulfill our sacred obligation to our veterans and their families who have sacrificed so much so that we can live free." On the battlefield, the military pledge is to leave no soldier behind. As a nation, let our pledge that when they return, we leave no veteran behind. Thank you. Anybody have any questions about the talk or the slides or anything else? Yes, Linda.
I had a question about the parade. You were talking about that came down the road. So who was on the sidelines watching all those people if they're all in this parade?
Well, no, that's an excellent point. Probably not an awful lot of people. As the procession, it was more of a procession than a parade. People just joined in. So it was people yelling and screaming, banging pots and pans, tooting horns, just marching all over the community. Maybe a few people looked out their windows, but those, I imagine, most wanted to be part of that procession as it made its way through Lebanon. Yes, Lynn.
John, so the boulder with the bronze plaque down by Running Field, that's where Running's rifles?
Yes, that's where they trained.
Okay, I always wondered when
Yeah.
I went by there. Okay.
Yeah.
Now I know.
Yes, that's where I gave my speech back in 2018 by that plaque. Well, thank you very much, folks, for being with us. Please remember that the gift shop is open with a 10% discount. Also, Harmon Museum is open for your free because of your being here. And hope to see you next month when Fred Compton is our speaker. Take care.